In this comic book is a love story, a boy and girl in love. They get married, and after an offensively lurid description, illustrated, of course, of the couple's wedding night, the book shows how the bride murders her husband by chopping his head off with an axe. This comic book describes a sexual aberration so shocking that I couldn't mention even the scientific term on television. I think there ought to be a law against them. Tonight I'm going to show you why.
When we came out with R3, very quickly, I think there were 130. Of course, they didn't have the art and they didn't have the stories. But in all honesty, I can't say they were gorier than we were because we figured we could out-gore anybody, and we did. Feldstein and I did almost all the writing for 3 or 4 years. And we worked as follows. We'd come in every day and we would sit down, and I would have springboards, and we'd try one springboard after another until we got a story we were happy with, and then we'd roughly plot it out, and then Feldstein would go out and write it.
Bill was a voracious reader. He'd read all night long sometimes. He was insomniac. And he'd come in the morning with a whole bunch of springboards, as he called them, and we'd talk about it. You know? Guy murders his wife and eats her. So he can get rid of the evidence. What should we do with it? So, we'd come up with some crazy gimmick with a snap ending. We always love to have shock endings and surprise things. Much like the kind of thing that Twilight Zone had afterwards and Alfred Hitchcock. What we were doing really was writing up to our readers. I was aware, having come out of the service, that there was a great readership out there of older adults, not just teenagers, not just children reading Funny Little Animal, but there were guys reading them in the barracks, and they were now back in civilian life, and they were still reading comics. Don't forget, this was before television really had its impact. We did get grosser and grosser, there was no question about it. But we were doing tongue-in-cheek horror stories. And they were starting to say things like, hey, you know, this is ruining our kids, and they're going to become ghouls, vampires, and murderers, which is a lot of nonsense.
A psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham suddenly got on a soapbox and began preaching against comic books.
Born in Munich, Wertham had been the senior psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital, as well as the director of a low-cost psychiatric clinic in Harlem. In the 1940s, he began conducting his own studies into abnormal behavior in young people.
He went around from prison to prison interviewing juvenile prisoners, and one of the questions we asked him was, what do you read? Well, he discovered that all of them read comics. Ergo, comics are destroying our society.
I think he had a genuine concern for kids, which got out of control.
These comic book covers that you are seeing here are a sample of what the children of the United States are reading today. 20 million copies of these comic books are pouring off the presses every single month. They're getting into the hands of children, and their contents match the covers. They are full of crime, terror, and horror.
They were attacking the crime comics, which preceded me. They were attacking Superman back in the 30s and 40s because some kid might think he could fly and jump off the roof. They attacked comic books because you couldn't read the print, and it was ruining all the kids' eyes. They came up with more damn reasons to attack comics over the years. It's really kind of ludicrous when you look back.
When I was a boy and played with the gang, we did a lot of things. We roasted potatoes and went on expeditions. We tipped over garbage cans now and then. We wrote nasty remarks about the teacher on the sidewalk. But we never spent an afternoon sitting around like this, reading. What a wonderful thing this would be if they were reading something worthwhile, something that would stimulate their desires to build and to grow. But they're not reading anything constructive. They're reading stories devoted to adultery, to sexual perversion, to horror, to the most despicable of crimes. The corpse that came to dinner. One of the wonderfully appealing things about children is that they haven't yet come to the age where reality and unreality are divorced. The emotional impact of something they read in a comic book may be much the same as a real-life situation they witness. Horror and crime comics upset kids. I'm not talking about any subtle distortion of their emotional makeup. I think that occurs too. But there's a more noticeable, immediate effect. You can see the tension develop as the story gets more gruesome. And if it's a bad one, the kid has a mass of jangled nerves by the time he's through it. I try always to contact the most highly qualified experts on the subject, so let's talk to some experts on comic books. You want to give me your name, son?
David Freeman.
And how old are you?
11.
Tell me how comic books make you feel, Dave.
Well, they don't make me feel too good. A couple of times I read a comic book, I threw up.
The real question is this: are comic books good or are they not good? If you want to raise a generation that is half stormtroopers and half cannon fodder with a dash of illiteracy, then comic books are good. In fact, they are perfect. Just a very short while ago, an 11-year-old boy committed a holdup in California and killed a woman of 42. And when the police came to arrest this 11-year-old boy, his older brother, who's 20, said, if you want to know the cause of all this, here it is. It's these rotten comic books. Cut them out, and things like this would not happen.
It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt, and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
The Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency had as a prime witness Wortham. Now, as soon as I heard this thing was formed, I asked for permission to appear.
2 decades ago, my late father was instrumental in starting the comic magazine industry. He edited the first few issues of the first modern comic magazine, Famous Funnies.
Famous what?
Funnies. I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wortham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
After the Senate subcommittee hearings, when the industry was somewhat in disarray, the other publishers kind of took over, and all they wanted was a censor. So rather quickly, they moved it along to the point where the Comics Magazine Association was formed, and the first thing they did was outlaw the words horror, terror, weird, and I think every word that I had on any of my titles, the association outlawed, which I thought was very funny. Although I wasn't amused, I was very angry.
Since October 26th, when the code was adopted, many comic books have undergone sweeping revisions. 440 magazines slated for publication in the early part of next year have been reviewed by my office. Out of these, 126 stories have been rejected outright as unsuitable. More than 5,656 drawings have been eliminated and replaced with panels that conformed with the code. In short, comics have undergone a major facelifting.
I remember the last comic that I ever put through the code was the last science fiction. I think it was Incredible Science Fiction 33. And we sent it up, and they absolutely refused to allow the fourth story to go through. So in one of my cleverer little ploys, I substituted Judgment Day, which may be the finest story we ever wrote, and sent it up in replacement. And they wouldn't pass Judgment Day unless I took the beads of perspiration off the astronaut's brow. He was, as you call, a black. He had perspiration at the end of the story when he takes off his helmet and you see he's a black, which was the whole point of the story. And I said no. I said, I'm not going to take him out, and if you persist, I am going to take you to court. I said, you are so wrong, and this is as far as I go with you guys. So I said, all right, let it go. And then, in my final thing, I never paid the dues for the last month. Which was just...
The code also enforced rigid rules of conformity. About authority, it said, policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. About parents, it said, respect for parents, the moral code, and for honorable behavior shall be fostered. About ghoulish activity, it said, scenes dealing with Walking Dead, vampires, and werewolfism are prohibited.